the swag on. Get the swag on.
Some thoughts about design that I wanted to share with you, and some things that I would like your help figuring out. So a little context, I came, sorry, that's really loud. I came to Paris a few weeks ago to speak at the Hackers on the Runway conference, and I decided to stick around for close to a month and just kind of get to know the startup culture here and work on a side project that I've been developing. We'll get more into that in a second. And so I've had a chance to speak with not only a bunch of startups that are part of the family and elsewhere. Yeah, and I think I'm starting to crack what's going on in this particular market and how it relates to what's happening with startups in San Francisco, in Montreal, where I spent a lot of time with startups and used to live. And so let's just dig into that a little bit today. I wanted to start by defining what we mean when we talk about design, at least in the context of this talk. Design is one of those words that's a little sacrosanct in some circles, and in others it's a little bit more loose. For my purposes here today, for our purposes, I want to talk a little bit about this Venn diagram. People who create products and services for people. And people who believe that only designers design. And I want us to be on this side. So, in other words, I want to define the word design a little bit more broadly. We talk about user experience, which is kind of the new buzzword. User experience is one of those terms that's been around for 10, 11 years or so. The newer version of that is service design, and we could argue all night about which is which and how do you draw a line between them. My point is, let's not draw lines between anything. We're in a point in time, especially in the startup world, especially with online services and even physical products, where from the minute your customer or your prospective customer learns something about your brand and your product and your story, to the moment they have it in their hands, and for the entire life of their relationship with you, that whole spectrum is the user experience. So I would argue, and I will argue, and I will fight you if you disagree, that there is not a person in your organization who is not part of that process. I would actually argue that everyone here is a designer. You are a designer. And I don't mean that to be glib, and I don't mean that to undermine a category of people who are very specifically involved in the very detailed work of visual design or interaction design. Those are very specific disciplines, and they're very important, and I don't mean to unravel those. And if I had to put myself in a box, I would consider myself more of an interaction designer than a visual designer. But I don't think it matters. I think what we're trying to get to is, in the conversations I had with a lot of people in Paris over the last few weeks, I keep getting back to that underlying theme, which is, well, we don't really have a designer on the team, or we're not really good at design, or we don't really think about design until later. We're really just thinking about the engineering right now, or we're thinking about the go-to-market strategy, or we're thinking about the business model. Those are all design. Those are all fundamentally the absolute aspects of what you're doing that connect with the customer. And if you don't think about all of those as design, if you don't try to solve them as design problems, if you don't engage with the customer's experience in mind, you're going to miss the opportunity. But also, I think there's a certain amount of kind of distancing of a lot of people that I've spoken with here from that process, because it feels like it's not their domain. Like they don't have the credentials to do so. Like they don't have the experience to do so. Like they can't draw, so they shouldn't be designing. And I guess what I want to get to today is those are all design. Everything that you guys are doing, whether it's engineering or marketing or sales, it's all a big part of it. And for those of you who are not, even in that really broad definition, is there anyone here who feels like they still don't fit in that category? Oh, good, good. I was going to say, if you were, then you might want to think about what you're doing connecting to your customer and connecting to whoever's using or interacting with your products. So I'm going to show the exact same product that Nick talked about before. I think the kind of global phenomenon of consumer awareness of design, at least this current iteration of it over the last couple decades, has a lot to do with what Apple has done over the last few decades. Of course, they're not the only company that's done really well-designed products, but this really underscores what Nick was saying, so I'll breeze through because he said it better than I will. The story of this product is actually, the technology of this product is no different than what was coming out prior to that. Maybe it had a larger capacity, the form factor was a little bit different, but it wasn't an engineering fix. It was crafting a new story about what this device meant for people's lives, right? This is kind of the soundtrack to your life. But really what it meant was prioritizing that entire experience and deprioritizing the engineering aspects of it so customers could understand the role that the thing had in their lives, rather than the specific technology involved. But moving forward a little bit closer to now, if you look at the wave of startups that are really just absolutely growing like gangbusters, whether they come from California or they come from elsewhere in the world, most of them, I would argue, most of the big, fast-growing ones, and the ones we tend to talk about today, and maybe the ones that you're involved in here today, are no longer technology problems. They're no longer technology solutions, right? Airbnb, has everyone here used Airbnb or have some experience with it? Airbnb is a user experience solution to a long-standing problem. There's another really, the big incumbent in the space was VRBO. Did anybody ever use that service? Vacation rentals by owner. I'm sure there are probably lots of examples in the French market. But this is about repurposing an existing asset, right? This is about changing an experience, and there's nothing about this that was involving technology. This is one of the fastest growing startups that's to have been founded by designers without an engineering background. Another example that I collided with a little bit today coming into the airport, but Uber and chauffeur privé and whatever other services you find in this category, these are not technology problems. Of course, there's some really smart technology for moving drivers around and for detecting where people need to be and for billing and all those kinds of details, but really this is about a better experience around taxis, which we've had for decades and decades and decades, right? It's just a better experience. This is a user experience solution to a problem. And I guess what I'm arguing is, I'll have another good example here. Wantful, French company. You say what you will. This is a visual design that doesn't speak to me personally. It feels a little bit off the sort of current aesthetic of what I consider interesting. But what's interesting about this company was that this was an entirely new experience around moving merchandise that wasn't selling in stores, right? So these are not examples of visually designed products, right? These are not examples of aesthetically pleasing products necessarily. They may well be. I think Uber's a good-looking service. Airbnb just did a refresh, whether you like their logo design or not. Aesthetically pleasing, but they're not about the visuals. They're about the user experience that they engender. So I spent a fair bit of time in the last, let's say, 20 years or so in 3 different industries, and I've moved around a lot, and I've lived in a bunch of different parts of the world. So for the second third of my career, I was working at Sony in Tokyo for a couple of years, running a design and R&D group there. And I came across a phenomenon that got me thinking about my experiences in Montreal, where I lived prior, and now my experience in San Francisco, where I've lived for close to 10 years. And even my experience over the last few days around the people that I've talked to about design in the Paris market in particular. And so if you're Japanese, you know this concept called dorodango. If you're a Japanese kid and you go to the beach or you go to the lake, one of the more common pastimes is this mud ball game, where you take a pile of mud and you form it into a sphere and you polish it and you polish it and you polish it. You might paint it. You might buy these little stands to put them on. And it literally, if you ask any Japanese about dorodango, they know exactly what it is. It is a favorite pastime. And when I started to talk to people about this, I took notice of this and I started to talk to people about their experiences with it. And it seemed like a very specific thing for everyone to be doing, for people to be obsessed with over generations. If you look at some other examples, they even sell kits. You can buy them in the store if you don't. It's getting harder and harder to find the right kind of mud in the place where you live. And when I talk to people about it, universally the response is, well, it's really fun, it's really creative. And for me, that struck me as a little bit odd, because growing up, if I went to the beach, we would make a sandcastle. And everybody would express themselves by doing a different kind of sandcastle, a different scale or a different style or what have you, or destroying it in a different way. But this sort of Japanese sensibility here was about refining the process of making a perfect sphere. How perfect was your sphere? And how perfect was your sphere was a model for how you express your creativity. How refined of a process could you develop around this relatively simple game from our perspective? And so, maybe it's easy to write off as one of those kind of cultural things that we don't understand, but I actually came to understand, or came to believe, that this is fundamental to the way the Japanese culture thinks about design. This is when I talk about design terroir. This is kind of what I'm getting at. If you look at the absolute apex of the Japanese economy and culture over the last 100 years, it really is post-war Japan leading up until about, let's say, 10 years ago, which is exactly when we saw the rise of the automobile manufacturing industry and the consumer electronics industry, both of which are really about the art of process refinement. They're about taking a template for something and refining the process over and over and over again and optimizing and building in quality and taking pride in those aspects of what is effectively a consumer user experience design problem. You might think, well, what does manufacturing have to do with design? It has everything to do with design. It has everything to do with the experience your customer has when she flips a switch on a piece of stereo equipment or when they get into a car and step on the gas. Those are all design problems. And I think the rise of these Japanese megacorporations and their influence on the world reached a peak about 10 years ago. What happened about 10 years ago? That's actually exactly when I was there. I'm not taking responsibility for it, but it was interesting to be in R&D at Sony, which is a world, I grew up in a world, we all grew up in a world where there was nothing but Sony. Sony was really the top of the top when it came to consumer electronics. And who came along out of nowhere? Apple. Apple had been around for a while, but Steve Jobs comes back, they launched the iPad, or the iPod rather, and slowly over the last couple of years, and then suddenly very quickly over the last few years, we started to see a total shift away from talking about the hardware, about lots of gadgets with switches and knobs, and a purely software-driven experience. And an obsessive, unrelenting focus on optimizing the quality of that software experience, which is a very different set of problems from optimizing hardware manufacturing or automobile manufacturing. And so I think part of what happened, if you look, it's maybe a little unkind to call the game for Sony or Panasonic, but a lot of these Japanese mega companies are really struggling to find their place in a software-driven world. They were the kings of the hill when they were basically running the game when it came to hardware and manufacturing. And so I think that's an interesting aspect to what they're doing. And another example I had earlier on, I spent, this is Jurassic Park. It's maybe a weird reference, but I moved to Montreal pretty much right out of film school in '97. And at that time, Montreal was starting to become kind of this buzzworthy kind of challenger to the burgeoning visual effects world in Northern California. For whatever reason, there started to be an entire generation of people who were brilliant not only at the artistry required to do visual effects, but they were brilliant at doing the technical artistry that's involved with things like animation and texture painting and so forth. Not only that, they were designing all the software and building all the software. So over the course of a couple years, Montreal became this hotbed of even today, if you look at all the main centers in the world for people who are doing visual effects, so Montreal, Northern and Southern California, London, Australia, New Zealand, there's Montrealers everywhere. They're everywhere. You can't turn the corner without seeing a very Quebecois name. It's fascinating. And the first part of my career was playing on that. I spent years building 2 really large animation studios. We had to hire 150 people at my second studio in the course of 3 months. And we hired them from all over the world, but they were all Montrealers. There were 2 people in that whole set that weren't Montrealers. And it turns out that a lot of this has to do with some practical things, like the way their degree system works and the way some of these schools had, sort of post-high school, pre-university, had programs that were about animation and starting to begin with that, and a few early entrepreneurs who were launching companies like Softimage and Discrete Logic, and then it just sort of coalesced around that. And this entire generation, and we're now maybe on the 3rd generation of people who have those same skill sets and really just took over an entire industry and drove it forward in a way that everyone can look to and say, that's really fascinating. It all came from Montreal. And now the visual effects business as such has kind of fallen apart. It's impossible to run a visual effects studio. The economics aren't there. So those people are slowly moving into gaming, but gaming has been much more broadly distributed. So we're starting to see that Montreal market looking for the thing that it's really good at. Probably guess what this example is. I'm American, and it really is true that you grow up American believing that you're a cowboy. and I don't mean to say it lightheartedly, but there really is a culture in America that you can do anything, no matter who you are, what your background is, that you're wasting your time if you're not trying, that you can get it wrong and try over again. And there's something about growing up in that world that makes us, sometimes it makes us uncomfortable citizens of the rest of the planet. But it also puts us in a position with respect to this startup culture that's happening right now, where everyone, to a person, believes that they can be Zuckerberg. And even Zuckerberg was that person, right? There was no Zuckerberg like him. There was nothing that precipitously fast or nothing that quite that successful as a model. But it was really that sort of, it's the gold rush, right? It's the same mentality that we went exploring in the western part of the States. And it's just so endemic to American culture that I think it's actually surfacing in startup land right now. And it's surfacing in a culture where we can try anything and not have to have a model for it. We can try a business model. We can try a ridiculous experience. We can say, well, there's photo sharing and there's social networking. What if we did like video sharing? And then, okay, what if we did photo sharing, but the photos disappear in 10 seconds? And then what if we go so ridiculously far as to have a service like Yo, where you share and the only thing the person gets is a Yo, and then you can Yo back? I mean, it really has reached absurd, almost epidemic proportions, but there is an underlying value system particularly in the Silicon Valley, that engenders that behavior, that allows people, not only even allows people, but almost pushes people into giving it a shot, into designing if you're a designer or not, right? You don't know how to write software? Why don't you learn how to write software? It's not that hard. Don't know anything about marketing? We'll figure it out. You think your light is going to change the world? Tell everyone it's going to change the world, even if you're not sure how you're going to manufacture it. Right? That's just part of the American culture, like it or not. I think we're sort of at that moment in time where, with respect to startups, we're able to play, for the most part, on those natural inherent attributes as a positive thing. How long that'll last, I don't know. We're already reaching the point where the tech world, particularly in San Francisco, is kind of we're second or third or even fourth generation in some cases. It's become this sort of self-involved obsessive thing where we're just throwing out ideas, like we're just crazy manic, just throwing out crazy ideas because any one of them could be a $19 billion company. But there is something about the culture in America and the expectation that you can and should and very well may be the next person who creates something of massive global import and of massive economic value. And frankly, even of massive, and this is a new thing, thanks to Apple and everyone else that came, and Plumen and everyone else that came before, even adds some real fundamental beauty and quality design, capital D design to the world, right? That's a new thing. That's new that the startup world is not just about an algorithm or a chipset or an engineering solution, a faster hard drive, any of those kinds of things. That it's about what is the quality of experience. You know, Airbnb just rebranded and they've been taking a lot of slack for it over the last couple of days. Is anyone following that story, or is that kind of insider baseball? So they rebranded and they really talk about themselves not as a way to rent out your spare room or save money on hotels, but as really as a profoundly human way to connect with people around the world. That's big stuff. That's design. Like, that's experience design. And that's like change the world kind of scale and stuff. When you look at the scale of that business, that's important stuff. And so suddenly those things that maybe make us badly behaved people at various parts of the way that the United States connects with the world has kind of put us in a position more recently where it's actually working to our advantage in that one slight bit. And so this is the part I wanted your help on, actually. I've been kind of formulating an opinion about what are some of the advantages and disadvantages, what are the predispositions, what are the structural realities of being French and being in the startup culture. But I kind of want you to throw out some thoughts as to what are you guys like? What's holding you back and what's encouraging you? I'll start with one example that I keep coming across that's been sort of on my mind for a while. I think there's a very strong reliance on logic in your education, in your pedagogy, that you use the word pedagogy. In the United States, we would rarely use that word in normal conversation, that you think about things in a very structured way. And I think that's a massive advantage, and I think you might be looking at these slides and saying, you could use a little structure. But I actually think that there's something about that that's a huge advantage, but maybe a disadvantage when it comes down to the world that we're talking about, which is two people throwing some ideas around, trying to coalesce around something that works. When it works, iterating so it works better and faster and for more people. Does that resonate with anybody at all? I think when you get into the design category, you're starting to get into a field where it doesn't need to be perfect, but it really wants to, because you know, if you take great care about the experience you're putting in front of your customer or your user or whoever you're building this for, you actually want it to be good enough. But we're also in a world where literally anyone on the planet who's used technology in any way now understands product development. It's the strangest thing in the world that you can be in a developing nation with a mobile phone that your entire family shares, and you can understand how software is built, at least to the degree that you know that this might be version 1 or it's beta. The word beta or the word version or like dot releases, all those ideas are now so commonplace that, you know, people talk about them on a regular basis who don't even understand that. But in other words, we're in a world where we want to have a perfect experience, but we have to hold back a little bit because we want to put it out there so we get some feedback, but we also want to have the perfect experience. What else? I mean, this is a culture that, at least from the outside, I think it's true deeply on the inside as well, is profoundly skilled for hundreds of years at everything tactile and sensorial, right? The arts are a massive part of the culture here. Awareness of those things and a common day-to-day discourse about those things is so important. So where's the disconnect coming for that turning into design, right? Because art and design are related, right? What we do as designers developing software is not art. We're doing it for commercial purposes, but they come from the same roots about what people respond to and why. I find there's an interesting tension there. Maybe we don't have to get to any more answers today, but I think there's something about those tensions. And the last thing that I found over and over again is that people have a hard time talking about what they're doing before it's done, and before they know they're going to be able to back up those claims, and before, even when they do, to talk about something that you're doing in a positive way seems a little bit like bragging. Absolutely the opposite is true in the United States to a massive fault sometimes, but it is absolutely true in the startup world that you need to talk a little bit about where you're going to craft that story, partly so people know that this is V1 and it's going to go in that direction. And sometimes it's easy to make too big of a claim and fall off a cliff, but by the same token, if people don't know where you're going with it, it's hard for them to establish an emotional connection to something. I think it's worth noting that there are lots of really compelling companies that come from here. A company that I've just gotten to know this past week. Do you guys know this company? Hadel, French company. They make really stunning headphones, really beautiful, obsessively focused on the sound quality and the engineering quality and the tactile experience of putting them on and taking them out of the box. All the things that you come to expect from a company like Apple. But this is, in fact, a very French company. I think the manufacturing's in Bretagne. But this is a product that I saw at 100 yards and walked up and said, I need to know where to get those. And the person said, I got them in Paris, and then I was coming here and met them, and absolutely underscores that there is the ability to surface this kind of quality of design. But even they are reluctant to talk about themselves in too positive a tone. I think Net-a-Porter and all of the things that they've done over the last, I don't know how long it's been now, maybe 7 years, maybe a bit longer. I think this is, without hesitation, one of the best online shopping experiences, bar none, of anyone in the world. And that's the space that I'm in. I'm in the retail space for years now, and I keep looking to Net-a-Porter and what they're doing and the way they navigate between online and print, and the way they engage with their consumer as absolutely best of breed. I think Wantful was really one of those companies that kind of invented a new form of commerce, and I think they deserve a lot of credit for that. But I think Net-a-Porter, in terms of the quality of experience and the way they engage and how easy they make it to take out your wallet and buy things that you don't necessarily need to buy. I think there's something about what they're doing that really has captured the essence of what online retail should be, and we don't see that from the big retailers in the United States. We don't see that. Curiously, we don't see that from many other companies in online retail, in particular the luxury companies that we talked to at the conference a few weeks ago. So I think there's some good examples here. So I wanted to just sort of touch on a few little details around how to design a design-driven startup. And if you're not in a startup world, I think this is equally true if you're a big company. I think it's equally true if you're an agency. How do you get design in front of people? I think the first part is knowing where you come from, knowing what your skills are. If you as a person and you as an organization, as a collective of all the people in your organization are, if everyone went to art school and everyone's been practicing design for 10 or 20 years, great, problem solved. But I think there are always going to be people in every organization that have advantages and disadvantages that come from their cultural makeup. And I think it's quite easy to solve those challenges or steer them in the right way, but you've got to be mindful of them. You've got to be mindful of, if you're a startup, you got to say, well, you know, I tend to overpromise because of my background, where I came from and the culture that I grew up in, or I tend to under-explain what I'm doing. I tend to be too modest about it, or I tend to assume that if you're an engineer, you have this degree and you can only do engineering, and there's no such thing as an engineer that has a point of view on design, or vice versa. Right? I think the reality is you can't build software anymore and be just a software developer, an engineer, or just an interaction designer, or just a visual designer. The world looks at you kind of funny because those disciplines are blended now. So I think knowing where you come from and playing to your strengths and being aware of your disadvantages. And then I think it's really about walking the walk. I think if you don't have training as a designer, if design is not the capital D, visual design, interaction design are not the things that you do day to day, you still need to be thinking about the experience that you're putting in front of people. And that's everything. That even touches finance decisions, right? That's every aspect of your business is about that experience you want people to have. And I think setting that tone. And of course, there are going to be things that if you're a 3-person startup and no one's got visual design chops or no one's got engineering chops, you need to find those people. But if you're mindful of where your strengths are and where your comfort level is, and you're also taking on the role, you're assuming that you are actually designing because you probably are, you'll notice where the other holes are and you'll be able to fill those rather than saying, well, we're going to do another version of this thing that was successful and we're going to try to replicate the user experience. Or we're not good at design, so we're going to do this thing and we're going to wonder why it hasn't really taken off. It's really about kind of assuming that you are in that role, that you are, and filling in the rest. And I think at the end of the day, it really comes down to prioritizing what's that experience. I think there has been a lot of mystique, especially over the last 10 years, that designers sort of took a position where the world paid attention to what they were doing. It wasn't just the frosting on top of the cake. It was really fundamental to the business of a company like Apple or the business of a company like Airbnb. And so suddenly designers got a little bit heady and started to think about all the different disciplines inside their world. And there's interaction designers and visual designers and information architects and all of these different sort of technical designers, all these different strata. And if you're not part of that club, you don't get to be in that club. And I think that's really untrue. I think everyone here has a role to play in designing an experience. And I think setting a culture forward of prioritizing that, asking the question, not only what is the impact on the bottom line, but what is the impact on the bottom line because the customer is unhappy? Not just what we need as a business, but what the customer is looking for and needing from us. I think those are all really important things. And the last thing I would say is just because I've spent a couple weeks here and really enjoyed myself, and I'm coming back for quite a lengthy stay in September and October, let me know how I can help. And I think there's a lot of potential here, but also a lot of amazing progress that the startups in this culture have made over particularly the last couple of years. And so I personally am interested in getting more involved in what goes on in the market here. And so even on the reverse side, if you're thinking about your position in the American market, you're thinking about how to break into the culture and lifestyle in the Silicon Valley, let me know how I can help. Here's my email. Thank you.
You were talking about know your territoire and the way that you can have multiple skills, and I totally agree with this. I'm still a engineer student, and I'm really interested with the design thing. But my point of view, and I spent like 2 months trying to learn a little bit more about the design system and stuff like that. And I think that you still need to be in one category. You cannot be like, okay, I'm an engineer, but I also know a little bit of design. I also know a little bit of entrepreneur stuff and so on. For example, when you look for an internship, you always have to, put your cross in the box. Yeah, I'm like an engineer. So I would like to know, what do you think about this and the future of this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a little bit what I'm talking about when I say it's not just your point of view, it's not just your opinion, it's an entire structure culturally around what you do and why. And I'd be lying if I said in the United States we don't think about your background as being more toward engineering or more toward design. But this last company, this is my 5th startup, and the last team was by far the most fluid in terms of who came in as a developer or engineer, even the distinction between those two, and who came in as a designer, and what people actually did. Because I think designers need some software development skills to know what they're doing, and engineers need to understand design in order to code well. And increasingly, with what's capable, in particular in iOS and Android apps and on the web, the tool sets are such that the capabilities, the user interaction experiences are such that you need to be able to do both. But to get back to your question, I think you just have to sort of fight it from the inside. You need to do a design internship, and then you need to do an engineering internship, and then you need to find a startup that needs someone who's capable of both. Or if not, you need to start a company and be a Mark Zuckerberg who's got better design skills. Because I think Mark really identifies as an engineer. Start an Airbnb. I think that's exactly how things change, is by people just sort of taking them up, getting on the horse and putting out the lasso and being a cowboy, for better or for worse.
You spoke about this Doro Dango game in Japan,
Yeah.
about how you constantly perfect a bow,
Yeah.
if I correctly understood.
Yeah.
Okay, but and on the other side, you are telling how it's a good thing, as I understood correctly, to push the design so that your product first sells as design and then as technology.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, maybe I'm exaggerating a little, but my point is, where do you put the brake? I mean, you cannot constantly perfect the design. Do you get my point? Those 2 points are in my head a little bit contradictory. You have to put the brake somewhere, and can you advise where to putting it? Do you get it, or was I unclear?
Yeah, I want to make sure I understand the question. I think, so what you're saying is how long do you perfect the design before bringing it out to market? I think 2 things. If you look back at these mud balls, I mean, they're beautiful, and they get more beautiful as they continue to get worked. But I think my point here was, and of course it's a little bit exaggerated and maybe a little bit facile, but in my experience in Japan, in a world where you have to design software and actually get it out to market before it's perfect, if your natural kind of cultural instinct is to never ship it until it's ready, because when you do, people die because you were making cars, or a piece of equipment explodes or catches fire, right? When you're dealing with physical products, or when you're dealing with some of those categories of products that Japan has been historically very, very good at manufacturing, they should not ship cars before they're done. That's a good instinct. But in a world where you have to develop a software experience that you don't understand and that your customers don't necessarily understand, and you need to establish a relationship with them around an emotional experience that evolves over time, I feel like culturally, part of the reason why we haven't seen a single Japanese company that's been a leader in software user experiences ever is related to that kind of cultural bias. And that cultural bias has been a huge advantage in the past, and I think it's currently a bit of a challenge for the Japanese. And I don't mean to suggest at all that I see that same instinct in the French market. I guess what I'm trying to say is, I actually see that you have some of the advantages of that bias in your training, in your structure, in the rigor that you learn. That's part of your culture. And you also have the creative side of a culture based on the arts, and I mean the total confidence that to be French is to be right about so many of those things, and to actually be right. But somewhere in the middle, there's a lack of assertion of those values. Right? There's a kind of disconnect in assuming that we're gonna do this. Me and these 2 other people are gonna come up with this idea. We've never designed anything in our lives, and we're gonna keep going at it until we get it right. And we're gonna talk to everyone about it, and we're gonna be open about it. I don't know if that answers your question, but no. Okay, we can talk more after.
You were saying something along the lines that if you're not wasting your time, I'm sorry, if you're not trying, you're wasting your time. Does that relate to failing harder? And can you tell us a little bit more about how you put yourself out there?
Yeah, I think there's a, I mean, me specifically or culturally? Yeah, I mean, I think there is a part of the startup culture now that is so, we can call it mature. I would be maybe a little bit more cynical about it, that if you're a college freshman or sophomore, if you're in your first or second year of university and you haven't at least been sitting around with your friends drinking and figuring out what your startup is going to be, you've completely missed it. It's like not dating or not playing sports or not listening to music. It is a cultural imperative in the university system in the United States, especially and the apex of all of that is at Stanford. It's true of every school, but at Stanford, it is the core of, I would say it's a fundamental part of your experience as much as the education is. That idea that you sit around and come up with an idea and loosely document it and start working on it. And, the reason it's part of that, it's part of the culture, is that people have done that many times, and they're now some of the wealthiest people in the world, which is crazy. That's absurd. And it's a wonderful thing, because the world is a better place for these startups, but it is a culture, for better or for worse, or for better and for worse, of people presuming that everyone should have a company, and everyone should be designing something, and people should go for it. And I think it has distinct advantages, and I guess what I'm saying is the culture there is very much one of presuming you are capable of it, and should at least give it a try. And if you fail, I had my last startup, Wantful. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of it. Was mostly focused in the U.S. market. We were 2.5 years old. We were growing incredibly fast, really deeply well-loved product, great press, everything. We got into a problem with one of our investors who backed out of something, kind of a long technical story, unrelated even to their commitment to what we were doing, and so we had to shut down the company. And this was almost, this is like 9 months ago now. I still get emails from customers saying, where is it? We need it back. I love this product. So much so that I'm working on something in the same space because I need to bring it back. But there's nothing about having done that that makes me unable to start something new. It's quite the opposite. You did this thing and somehow it didn't work, whatever the reasons were, whether people know the reasons or not. The question is, what's next? What are you going to do next? They wait for you to get back on the horse, and you getting on the same kind of horse, or are you building a car, or what are you doing? It's just part of the culture there. And I think in other cultures, I'm not saying specifically French culture, I think in other cultures, there's the idea of entrepreneurism strikes some cultures as a little bit weird. Like, why are you pushing like that? Why would you presume to do that? You have ideas beyond your station, or whatever cultural sort of form that takes. I think for whatever reason in the United States, we just have that culture where everyone can and should. And I think, I don't mean to say that, go America, we're great for that. I have my own qualms with that. I have my own kind of hesitations with that being a big part of our culture, because it manifests in some pretty grotesque ways elsewhere. But at this point in time, in a world where you can, for $5,000, maybe less if you know how to do it yourself, you can build a website or an app or an experience or even a physical product that turns into something that's worth $19 billion. Or taking aside the money question, that's got billions of people on the planet using it on a daily basis to communicate and stay in touch, and has that kind of profound, visceral impact on the human condition. That's powerful stuff. And I think you guys feel it. That's why you're here. I guess what I'm trying to get to is, what do you feel like is keeping you, making you hold back? Because I don't think there's an investor or a customer in the world that wouldn't jump at your beautifully designed, well-executed product if they knew about it at the right time. And so I guess what I'm trying to do is encourage you guys to act a little bit more American within limits, and keep the things that make this culture such a powerful one. Because I really do feel like part of why I'm spending all this time here is that I really think the startup culture here has a chance of really breaking out and really being fundamental. I think that the question of why do we not have swag here? I think you got plenty of swag. You just ask questions like, why don't we have swag? You got all the swag in the world. Just let it shine. So.
Get the swag.